Hi, my name's Chloe.
And I'm Claire, and we decided to do our final project on the Underworld.
Nobody's really sure where in the world the Underworld is. In the Iliad, it states that the Underworld can be found below the secret places of the earth. But in the Odyssey, it states that you must cross the ocean and go over the edge of the world to find it. It is rumored that other ways to enter the Underworld are hidden caves and deep lakes.
In the Underworld, there are 5 rivers: Archeon, Cocytus, Phlethion, Lethe, Styx. Each river has their own job and meaning. The Archeon is accompanied by Charon. The Charon would carry souls from the upper world to the underworld.
Another part of the Underworld was the divisions. The way a person acted during their life on Earth affected which divisions they would go into in the Underworld, kind of like karma. To see which division you would go into, you would be presented to a judge. The judges of the Underworld were Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus.
If the judges decided you behaved well during your time on Earth, you would be sent to the Elysian Fields. The Elysian Fields, the souls could dance and listen to music played by Orpheus and his lyre. If the judges decided you were a cruel person during your time on Earth, you would be sent to the place of darkness called Tartarus.
Tartarus was the deepest place of the Underworld, and the souls that were sent there would live their afterlife in pain. Once you were sent there, there was no chance of escaping.
Now we will recall a story about a man named Steve and his experience in the Underworld with his unexpected mentor, Charon.
Steve was just your common ordinary Greek man. He lived close to his town's courtyard, and his house was even a little nicer than the average Greek home. In the courtyard, Steve was the life of the party.
Steve liked to spend most of his spare time in the Ardon. The Ardon was the room in the courtyard where the men in the village would go to socialize with their friends. Steve always met his best friend there.
Steve's best friend's name was Marco. Marco didn't always have the best life growing up. When he was born, his parents abandoned him, which is a common thing to happen in ancient Greece. When the parents had their baby and it was a girl, or the boy didn't look strong enough, they would often abandon them.
Marco moved from house to house when he was little. Living on scraps and never having a true home was tough. Then Marco came across the nicest family ever, Steve's family. They raised him until he was strong enough to take on the world on his own.
Steve and Marco remained close throughout all the years, and if there was 2 people who always had each other's back, it was Steve and Marco. Steve never thought that Marco would do anything to harm him.
And then something terrible happened. Something Steve never imagined would happen to him. Steve was arrested.
He was taken to jail in his town's courtyard and was confused as ever. He was begging the guards to let him go because he was innocent and didn't know what he could have done wrong.
He sat in a cell in the cold air and wished he was in his home. Steve longed for his best friend Marco to be there with him. 2 hours had gone by, and Steve still didn't know why he was arrested. Then what he had been hoping for came true. Marco appeared outside of his cell in the town courtyard.
"I'm so sorry," said Marco, "but I had to do it." "Do what? Did you put me here?" said Steve in a hushed voice. "I had to. I can't live my life in a cell. I grew up living on the streets with no family and no food," stated Marco. "Why did you do this to me, Marco? I've done nothing but good things for you." "What crime did you even commit to put me here?" Steve said more angrily.
After I grew up and moved out of your house, I started living a life of a thief. I've been stealing from a market for 15 years now, and they started catching on to it. They finally found out it was me and arrested me earlier in the day. I made up a lie and told them it was you. I didn't know who else to blame it on. You've always had a life of luxury, and I thought it was time you had something bad happen to you, said Marco. "So I'm stuck here for life?" yelled Steve. "Yes, that's the penalty for stealing." "I'm sorry, but I need to leave now," Marco said as he was leaving.
"So that's all you're going to tell me? Marco, I thought we were best friends," said Steve. Steve ended up spending his life in jail and died of natural causes in his cell. Then he woke up in a strange place.
It was a dark place with an eerie feeling, and was almost like he was dreaming. He sat there for a while, trying to become aware of his surroundings, when all of a sudden a man appeared in a hooded robe. "Do you know where you are?" said the cloaked man. "Obviously not," said Steve. "You're in the Underworld, on the bank of the Acheron River. But you need to come with me. I will transport you to the judge's court. I'm the only one who can be on these rivers, but inside my boat you're safe." "My name is Charon," stated the cloaked man.
Steve jumped into Charon's boat and traveled onto the 5 rivers of the Underworld. He saw the entire Underworld, it seemed like. On his travels to the courtroom, he saw Hades' palace, the grove of Persephone, and even a glimpse of the Elysian Fields.
Steve and Charon finally arrived at the plane of judgment after traveling for what felt like forever. Charon explained what would happen in the courtroom and said, "I know your story of the life you had before this, but the judges don't. They will think you're guilty of the crime that you did not commit, but give me the time to persuade them."
Steve entered the court and a blast of cold air hit him. He could hear distant screams of souls begging not to be sent to Tardis. The judge slammed his wrist on the table and the screams stopped. "So I've heard of your crimes you've committed on Earth, stealing for 15 years and almost continuing to get away with it. You must not have been grateful for all that you had growing up. You had everything but still felt the need to steal, didn't you?" said the judge.
"You don't understand. It wasn't me. I was blamed for that crime. I never have stolen in my life," pleaded Steve. "Well, if it wasn't you, then who was it?" said the judge. "It was my friend. He blamed me for his crime. He said he couldn't handle jail, so he told the guards it was me, so I spent my life in prison," said Steve.
The court case finished, and Steve was dismissed to be free for a day in the Underworld. As he was leaving the judge's plane, he saw Charon entering the courtroom.
Steve crossed his fingers and hoped for the best. The judges knew Charon, so Steve thought maybe Charon could help with getting out of being sent to Tardis, but Minos seemed pretty unconvincing.
Steve knew he had to escape. He couldn't deal with the horrors of Tardis. The stories he had heard of Tardis were terrifying. There was no escaping, but maybe he could escape the Underworld.
He started running along the banks of the rivers, trying to be hopeful about some sort of exit, but was unsuccessful. He ran even farther and found something unusual that might help him.
It was a surrounding wall of Hades' palace. He knew from when he was coming into the Underworld with Charon that he needed to keep going straight so that he would run into the river bank of Styx.
As he approached the banks of the Styx, he ran into none other than Servius. The big three-headed guard dog could sense that he was trying to leave the Underworld, so he started chasing Steve. Steve was running so fast, but he knew he was going to be eaten by Servius.
Just as Servius was about to close his jaws around Steve, a man jumped down and saved him. It was Marco. Servius knew that Marco would stay in the Underworld, so he backed off. Marco showed Steve the way back to the plane of judgment and would talk to Steve.
They arrived back at the plane of judgment, and Marco finally spoke. "I never forgave myself for what I did to you, and now it's time for me to pay the price that I made you pay," Marco said. Steve's jaw dropped and walked into the courtroom behind Marco. When they entered, they saw Charon.
Charon was trying to stand up for Steve, but Minos the judge wasn't listening. But then Marco walked forward. "Minos, it wasn't Steve who committed the crime, it was me. Steve was actually the one who cared for me as I was growing up, and I should never have blamed him for my stealing."
Minos hit his gavel and proclaimed that Marco will go to Tardis and live there forever. Then he stated, "Steve, the Underworld apologizes for believing you stole for 15 years, and because of that, you will get to fulfill your life in the Underworld living in the Elysian Fields."
Steve was so happy he thought that he was going to die, but then he remembered he was already dead. Charon transported Steve to the Elysian Fields where he lived, or should I say dead, happily ever after.